Good morning. The Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on environmental justice or environmental injustice in Indigenous communities. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Hearing no objection, so ordered. As described in the hearing notice, statements, documents, and motions must be submitted to the electronic repository hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. I will begin the hearing by recognizing myself for opening statements. First, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the witnesses for taking the time to join us this morning, and also for a witness who is joining us in the early morning hours from Hawaii. That's true dedication to helping us understand the stories of what's happening in Hawaii regarding environmental justice work, and we are grateful for your presence. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency defines environmental justice as being the, I quote, fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. While the statement is forward-looking for a federal agency, on the ground, so many of us know so deeply that the environmental justice movement seeks to address a long-standing statistical fact, which is that the communities who are impacted most by pollution are commonly communities of color, Indigenous peoples, and the economically disadvantaged. As environmental justice advocates have demonstrated, it's these low-income and communities of color that are routinely targeted to host facilities and projects that have significant environmental impacts. With the promise of economic growth or jobs, these communities are often forced into a false choice between their and their neighbors' health and some limited job opportunities. Communities, and especially communities of color, have been battling this injustice for decades and have led to what is known as the environmental justice movement. It is important, though, that as we consider the theme of this morning's meeting, how Indigenous communities factor into this movement. While we must support the many communities battling environmental injustice, let's be clear, tribal nations are not simply communities of color. They are sovereign nations that maintain legal and political identities rather than racial ones. The federal government's responsibility to tribal nations is not one of race. It's one of political and legal precedent. It's one of trust, the trust responsibility. And we must remember that these tribal nations once occupied what is now the lands of the U.S. We are holding this hearing on the ancestral homelands of Anacostia and their many neighbors. Through broken treaty after broken treaty, the government has pushed the Indigenous tribes into ever smaller portions of land. And in exchange arose the trust responsibility by which the federal government has said that it will exercise that trust.
Westerman is going to talk
on behalf of the tribes. But as Congress considers this trust responsibility as it's related to environmental justice for tribal communities, we must acknowledge that this responsibility comes out of obligation, not choice or altruism. If the federal government is not supporting the health and well-being of tribal communities, including the protection of tribal lands and tribal resources, whether they be mineral or water or timber, then it is violating its trust responsibilities. Sadly, we can clearly see examples of this failure across Indian country, from the abandoned uranium mines on the Navajo Nation and throughout New Mexico on the Pueblo of Laguna, to the orphaned wells and gas wells of the Osage Nation. Evidence of the federal government's exploitation of tribal lands and resources seems to be ongoing and never ending. This history of environmental exploitation is not only unjust, it's a default of the federal government's trust obligations to tribal nations. Further, is it important for us to recognize the unique ways that Indigenous communities have been engaging in environmental justice since time immemorial? Protecting and preserving their traditional lands and natural resources is an inherent aspect of Indigenous traditional teachings. To many tribal nations and citizens, there is a direct link between a healthy natural environment and a healthy community. The teaching and practice of traditional customs have proven that Indigenous ancestors of this country knew this land and its relationship to health and well-being. Before there was contact and colonization, there was a plethora of unwritten Indigenous knowledge. It's these teachings that need to be part of the conservation when we begin to talk about healing our environment. Because of this, climate scientists and environmental activists have significant opportunities to learn from Indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge. By centering mainstream environmental initiatives around the perspectives and teachings of Indigenous communities, we will be better equipped to address the impacts of climate change and environmental justice. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today to learn about how their nations and communities are bridging Indigenous knowledge with environmental science to heal our earth so future generations can enjoy its beauty. Environmental justice is such an important movement today, but it's crucial that we understand how this conversation is unique in Indigenous communities. I'm very thankful to have such incredible witnesses here today, and I look forward to hearing more from each of you. I now recognize Ranking Member Obernolte for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for convening this hearing on an incredibly important topic, the topic of environmental justice for Indigenous communities. It is an undeniable fact that quite often the burden of fighting climate change falls disproportionately on those who can least afford to pay it, like many of our Indigenous communities. That includes the burden of having to support pollution from energy development, but it also includes the burden of having to pay higher energy prices when we have insufficient energy development. I'm in hopes that hearings like this one will result in a greater respect for tribal sovereignty. I believe that our Indigenous communities are well suited to be stewards of their land and to decide for themselves what projects are appropriate for tribal lands and which are not. And I think they should have a seat at the table when those energy development projects come up, both to express concern for the environmental impacts on those projects, but also to express support when appropriate for the economic impacts that energy development might have on them. Madam Chair, I would also urge that in the future, hearings like this include the executive branch. I think the administration would have valuable input on this particular topic. And also, I think it's important that everyone have a seat at the table when we talk about important topics such as this one. I'm looking forward to the hearing, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here. I yield back.
Thank you, Member Obernolte. I would also like to note that we have the benefit of having our chairman of the full Committee of Natural Resources, Chairman Grijalva, who is with us here today, and I look forward to having his participation as we hear from our witnesses. Chairman Grijalva, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I associate myself with your opening comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I would also note that we also have the ranking member of the full committee with us, Representative Bruce Westerman. And Mr. Westerman, the chair now recognizes you for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm glad that we're talking about justice today, and I hope we will really look into what that word justice means, because it means to make right. And when we want to make things right, does that mean that we take away people's economic opportunities? Does it mean that we tell them as a government how things should be? And I hope we'll really take a serious look at what that word justice means as we talk about it in the hearing today. I want to thank the witnesses for being with us. And out of respect for the special status of Indian tribes, the United States and its agencies consult with Indian tribes on proposed actions that may affect their interests. And I think that is part of justice. This obligation was formalized in Executive Order 13175 in 2000, which contained instructions for agencies to establish procedures to, and I quote, meaningful consultation and collaboration with tribal officials in the development of federal policies that have tribal implications to strengthen the United States government-to-government relationships with Indian tribes, end quote. Tribal consultation is key to ensuring that tribes are heard during federal actions. The effectiveness of tribal consultation often varies from case to case, often depending on the efforts of local agency officials. Whether this process could be improved is certainly worth discussing. However, I do have some concern those on the other side of the aisle aim to use environmental justice as a way to create new environmental mandates, processes, and regulations that will stifle energy and infrastructure development and drive up cost for Americans and tribal communities that are already energy starved. And I wouldn't label that as justice. Using, quote, environmental justice to increase regulations and procedures will result in more infrastructure being shut down and less coming online. Additionally, it could also hinder clean energy development on tribal lands and deplete critical sources of conservation funding that improve the environment. I don't see how that makes things right. Instead, we must work together to invest in innovation and streamline energy and infrastructure development for those tribes that wish to develop those resources. That is justice. This will allow tribes to benefit from the jobs and other economic benefits provided for these projects. For example, current development of natural resources on tribal lands can help pay for education, healthcare, culture and language preservation, and other essential tribal programs, which I think we would all consider that part of making things good and making things right. Moreover, cutting red tape to allow for tribal economic development is a better option than paying people not to work, which is what the current administration seems committed to doing. Rather than shackle economic development on tribal land, Congress should examine innovative ways to responsibly utilize domestic energy supplies while improving conditions within tribal communities. We can have these jobs and protect the environment at the same time. For example, the Southern Ute Indian tribe, who is with us here today, has partnered with 8 Rivers Capital LLC to develop the Coyote Clean Power Project, locating one of the world's first zero emissions net power natural gas fired power plants within their reservation. That's a mouthful to say that, but it's amazing technology that the Utes are doing. The Coyote Clean Power Project will produce 280 megawatts of clean power 24/7 while capturing and storing CO2. This is a great example of innovation that we should be fostering. I believe we have an obligation to leave the world better than we found it and reject the premise that a healthy environment and a strong economy are mutually exclusive. That's why Republicans are taking thoughtful, scientific, decisive action on environmental policies. I hope to see even more of my Democrat colleagues join with us in these efforts. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses to identify how we can help the government to get the government out of the way to allow tribal communities to thrive. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Westerman. I would now like to transition to our panel of witnesses. Before we begin, I would remind the witnesses that we'd encourage you to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. And you can find out more about that in your hearing invitation materials. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes. But as you know, you may submit a longer written statement for the record if you choose, and I appreciate the statements you have submitted. When you begin, the on-screen timer will begin counting down. It will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses use the grid view, and then you can lock the timer on your screen. When you go over the allotted time, I will ask you to please wrap up your statement so that everybody has a chance to both be heard and to ask questions. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid inadvertent background noise. I will allow the entire panel to testify before we question the witnesses. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Ira Taken Alive, who is the vice chairman for the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. Vice Chairman Ira Taken Alive.
Hauhienachji, Milahaska Itranchawina Itranchawicha, Oyate Trachante Emachia, Ia Waslate Pohomnicha Itrancha Inum Hemachelo, Lila Dayan Yachielo. Good morning, Madam Chair Ledger Fernandez, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Westerman, and members of the House Subcommittee on Indigenous Peoples. My name is Ira Taken Alive, and I serve as the Vice Chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe. It is a tremendous honor for me to provide some history of my tribe as it pertains to environmental justice. So I extend my gratitude to the committee for the opportunity to testify today. I'm present today to speak about environmental justice doctrine, specifically how after 2 decades since the president issued an executive order mandating that federal agencies consider environmental justice issues in their decision-making, and how the agencies are still failing to properly consider environmental justice issues in their decision-making processes. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe is a successor to the Great Sioux Nation, or as we call ourselves, Ocheti Shakowee, is a signatory to several treaties with the United States government. In these treaties, the United States recognized our territory and promised to protect us in our homeland. But the United States did not keep most of its word. Due to demands for gold in the Black Hills and later for lands to welcome European immigrant homesteaders, vast amounts of our lands were taken without our consent as prescribed by the treaties. Additionally, through federal statutes enacted over time, our reservation has been reduced to what it is today. In 1942, Congress enacted the Flood Control Act, which authorized the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to construct 5 dams along the Missouri River, including the Oahe Dam and Reservoir. As the project began to impact Standing Rock in 1958 by flooding 56,000 acres of our best reservation lands, numerous Standing Rock families lost their homes and their livelihoods. My maternal great-grandparents and grandparents were among these many families. The loss devastated not only families, but also strained our tribal economy and diminished our cultural relationship with the Missouri River. Thus, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe has a history of dealing with United States government actions that do not take into consideration the profound to devastating impacts to our families and our communities. Sadly, these failures are not relegated to the 19th and 20th centuries. The U.S. Army Corps' actions related to the Dakota Access Pipeline serve as perfect examples of a federal agency failing to properly consider environmental justice doctrine in its decision-making. The failure to address tribal concerns at the outset, coupled with the failure to seek alternatives that would not immediately endanger the health and safety of our people, led to controversy and costly litigation, where a federal court ultimately found that our concerns with the pipeline were correct and that the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Army Corps of Engineers failed to comply with federal law. In 2016, the tribe filed a lawsuit challenging the decisions of the Army Corps to publish a flawed final environmental assessment and to issue certain permits. During the course of this litigation, the Army Corps, along with the Department of Justice and the Department of the Interior, announced that the important issues raised by our tribe regarding the Dakota Access Pipeline had remained, and that the Army Corps would consider these issues before granting any easement. This action represented the first time that the United States sought to determine if this pipeline might be done in a better way so that our tribe and our resources do not bear the burden of this pipeline. The Army Corps took the first formal step to implement this path on January 18, 2017, when it published a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement. However, less than a week later, President Trump issued an executive order to take all necessary actions to review and approve in an expedited manner all requests for approvals to construct and operate the Dakota Access Pipeline. This action harkened back to a time when presidents exercised executive powers to take our tribal lands, remove Indian people from their homelands, and to terminate tribes. We firmly believe that the United States is a nation of laws, so we continued our lawsuit challenging the environmental assessment and the granting of this easement. As a people of Standing Rock, we are hopeful that the United States government does not miss the opportunity to get this right next time. The people of Standing Rock should not have to experience loss again for the sake of other communities and other people's gain. This concludes my oral testimony, Madam Chair. Written testimony has also been submitted for the record. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Vice Chairman. The chair now recognizes the Honorable Melvin J. Baker, who is the chairman of the Southern Ute Indian Tribe. Chairman Baker.
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Fernandez, Ranking Member Young, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Melvin J. Baker. I am the elected chairman of the Southern Ute Indian Tribe Tribal Council, which is the governing body of the Southern Ute Indian Tribe. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on the tribe's efforts to protect the environment while utilizing the tribe's energy resources. The testimony that was provided to you goes into greater detail on the tribe's methane capture history and its recent clean energy development project, the Coyote Clean Power Project. The Southern Ute Indian Reservation consists of approximately 700,000 acres of land located in southwestern Colorado. Approximately 311,000 surface acres of that land is held in trust by the federal government for the benefit of the tribe. As a result of the complex history of the reservation, the tribe also owns several oil and gas minerals and coal estates that are held in trust by the United States on additional portions of the reservation. The tribe, with just over 1,500 members, is a leader in Indian country, with a demonstrated and stirring record of foresight and business acumen. The tribe is the only Indian tribe in the nation with a AAA credit rating, which was earned through years of steady governance and successful and prudent business transactions. Though the tribe has a diversified portfolio, energy development remains a key component of the tribe's diversified portfolio. With over 70% of the tribe's revenue coming from energy development, accordingly, we are well positioned to speak to the relationship between the energy development, prosperity, and tribal self-determination. The EPA's treatment as a state rule enabled the tribe to create its own Clean Air Act Part 70 operating permit program, the first and only tribe in the nation to do so. Under this program, the tribe has permitting, inspection, and enforcement authority over major sources of air pollution on the reservation. Without treatment as a state status or the ability to assume federal programs through some other delegation mechanism, the EPA would be solely responsible for permitting, conducting inspections, and enforcing federal air quality and water quality laws on the reservation, resulting in a significant regulatory underpresence on the reservation. For example, there are approximately 300 oil and gas-related minor sources of air pollution within the reservation that are currently regulated by the EPA. The EPA only inspects the 6 largest of the minor sources once every 5 years. The states that have received EPA delegations are required to conduct compliance inspections at all minor sources on a regular basis. However, states receive federal grant funding to fulfill environmental requirements and to support environmental programs such as minor new source review program. Currently, government institutions compliance the role that tribes can fill in regulating minor sources. The tribe has attempted to address this disparity in compliance and enforcement of minor sources on the reservation by requesting a delegation of the federal minor new source review program in Indian country. However, the EPA has indicated that it does not have the funding to support a delegation of this program to the tribe. This is a significant example of the disparity that continues to exist on tribal lands in the level of environmental compliance and enforcement oversight between the state jurisdictions and Indian country, and the financial challenges tribes face in obtaining delegation of federal environmental programs. Under the current administration, the shift to net zero carbon emissions and clean energy production emphasizes why delegation of federal environmental programs is vital to reduce air pollution and the carbon footprint in Indian country. We support the holistic approach to climate change by leveraging the natural resources in each region where energy is consumed to reduce carbon emissions on tribal lands. Within the United States and around the world, we cannot allow policy changes to exclude technological advancements because they are not considered renewables or to export carbon emissions from one area of the country to another, or even to a different part of the world, as our Earth only has one atmosphere. A holistic approach to carbon emissions delegation of federal environmental programs and project life cycle environmental impacts requires transformation of future businesses and energy development to address climate change and other environmental or cultural impacts. An example of this holistic approach is apparent when considering land use associated with power development on our reservation, which is a very culturally sensitive area. When the amount of electricity generated per acre of land used by the proposed Coyote Clean Power facility is compared to a renewable technology like solar, there is 99% less surface damage disturbance of tribal lands. The tribe will continue to be stewards of our environment and responsibly develop its natural resources to provide education, health care, culture, and language preservation, and other core programs to its tribal members. The tribe has successfully owned, operated, and participated in numerous business opportunities both on and off the reservation, the Southern Ute Reservation, and is interested in leading the way by collaborating with stakeholders to develop and commercialize real-world solutions for the energy transition to net zero carbon environment. Thank you for the time to testify before you today and for your interest in the Southern Ute Indian tribe. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chairman. The chair would now recognize Mr. Herb Lee Jr., who is the president and CEO of the Pacific American Foundation. Mr. Lee.
Everybody, Madam Chair and members of the committee, thank you so much for allowing me an opportunity to share my story. I'm Herb Lee, and my story is about an ancient Hawaiian fish pond. And in the history of Hawaii, these ancient Hawaiian fish ponds were really remarkable feats of engineering that were able to allow our Hawaiian ancestors to be able to propagate food. Fast forward in the 21st century, these fish ponds that used to number close to 500 are less than 15% and are on the verge of vanishing from the landscape in our lifetime. The story that I have is one of, it's a remarkable story of how we've been able to restore this fish pond, Waikalua Local. It's located on the island of Oahu, on the windward side in Hawaii. It's about 400 years old and it's about 12 acres in size. And I started this restoration process about 25 years ago with the idea that, we were trying to physically restore a pond that had been neglected for probably over 100 years. And the result of a lot of impact of environmental degradation, urbanization, pollution from the mountain to the sea and things like that. So it's taken us over 25 years to actually begin to restore it. But in the process, what we stumbled upon was an opportunity to nurture minds and people's spirits in a different way besides just propagating. And to this day, we have not been successful. None of the ponds that have begun restorations that remain have been able to be commercially viable or to be able to propagate food as they were originally intended. However, the story that I wanted to share is being able to actually, as part of the restoration, develop some very innovative educational programs where we've been able to bridge indigenous wisdom and knowledge with 21st century contemporary knowledge, technology, science in really creative and innovative ways. And we've, been very thankful for all of the partnerships that we've been able to make. We've now, over 25 years, have been able to develop 21 different titles, starting with fish ponds to teach all of the core academic areas, science, mathematics, social studies, language arts in the context of these fish ponds. And this journey has allowed us to reach more than 100,000 people that have come to help us restore. We've been able to train now 6,000 teachers statewide and form over 200 partnerships to advance the restoration and the education of these ponds. And more importantly, to begin to solve problems regarding climate change and environmental degradation that has occurred in our area, and be able to use both traditional wisdom and contemporary science and knowledge in creative ways to help solve problems. In the next 25 years, I have set a new course and agenda to really focus on propagation that none of us have been able to do, and try to develop using, again, traditional wisdom and science and technology and knowledge to be able to create a new generation of aquaculture products and an economy that can hopefully restore us. All of our nearshore fisheries in Hawaii are basically fished out now. And so I believe that these ponds hold the key to us being able to restock the nearshore fisheries of Hawaii, as well as be able to feed our people and become more food sustainable. More than 90% of our food comes from ships to the islands, and we have no more than a 2-week supply to sustain the population in Hawaii now. And we hope that in the next 25 years that we'll be able to flip that and go back to like how we used to be and be more self-dependent and self-sufficient. Can we do this? Absolutely. We believe that if we all pull together on this, that anything can be accomplished. We've made some wonderful partnerships. We are part of the Smithsonian Marine Geo Program, which is called the Global Earth Observatory. And we've been able to involve students working hand in hand along with global scientists to learn about global climate change, and more importantly, how to begin to find solutions proactively together. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to share. I did submit testimony as well, and I hope you get a chance to read it. Thank you. Aloha.
Thank you. Aloha. Thank you, Mr. Lee, and thank you to each of our panelists for their testimonies and their stories. I am now going to turn to questions. I'm going to remind the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. And we will begin our series of questioning by recognizing Chair Grijalva for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the courtesy. I appreciate it very much. As you know, and as I associated myself with your comments at the beginning, and it is an important topic to talk about justice. And I think we have to look at justice in many ways. Mr. Westerman is right. And one of them is a corrective action, that we have a responsibility as members of Congress to forge legislative efforts that are corrective, that take us away from that history of systemic discrimination and racism, takes us away from it. And I hope toward that end, we're having this hearing because I think it's very important. Yes, you know, I introduced 2021 HR, Environmental Justice for All Act. It involves stakeholders in the environmental justice community from across the country. It's a good, robust piece of legislation. But although there are significant portions related to Indigenous peoples in the bill, we realize that there's still a need to discuss and incorporate with the Indigenous communities and see what environmental justice means to them. It's not a monolith concept. And while the injustices in Indigenous communities are widely known, they're very different from other marginalized communities in this country that also suffer the effects of environmental injustice. And so going forward, you know, the federal government has not always seen environmental justice as part of any federal trust responsibility with Indigenous communities. And so the exploitation of tribal lands and resources are examples to me of environmental injustice. And we should not underestimate that effect. I hope that I know that we've heard from our witnesses today, and I thank them very much for the points that they've made and their testimony. And let me just begin very quickly by asking Mr. Vice Chairman, and thank you for being here and thank you for your testimony. In your position as a leader of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, has the federal government's exploitation, for lack of a better word, of tribal land and resources, in your mind, violated that very essential part that is different from any other groups, and that has to do with the federal trust responsibility to tribes? Do you feel that's been violated, not only in the issue of the pipeline, but in other issues that you might reference?
Most definitely. I know that the ranking member Westerman had made reference to the executive order requiring meaningful tribal consultation. And in our experience, some of the agencies had counted making a phone call to our tribal office and leaving a voicemail message as a tribal consultation for the record in their findings. So, but of course, to us, making a phone call, leaving a voicemail message does not constitute meaningful consultation. Meaningful consultation would have allowed us to provide any of our expert knowledge, our cultural knowledge, and certainly incorporate our beliefs and our visions to have meaningful consultation on any projects. So I believe that meaningful consultation is an important process, an important element to government relations, especially as they relate to environmental justice and honoring our treaty rights and the legal federal obligations to Indian tribes.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the consultation process, how it's done, how it is uniformed, how it is enforced, how it is followed, what is the criteria, what is the checklist to make sure that it is meaningful in the full sense of the word, that is a part of responding to this environmental injustice issue that we're talking about generally. I think that either codifying that or formalizing that into something that's real, I think would be a huge part of dealing with this question. You can correct me if I'm wrong. In terms of tribes.
That would be very much appreciated, Chairman.
Okay, thank you. I don't know how much time I have. Mr. Lee, climate change, how has that affected your restoration and preservation of the fish pond in terms of, as you said, that there's been some challenges to overcome?
Yeah, primarily from 2016, we began events that typically
Mr. Lee, we cannot hear your answer. You're breaking up. If you can hear me, maybe you can get closer to the microphone. And we have 1 out of 10, but if you could do a short answer.
And I yield back, and thank you very much for your courtesy, Madam Chair.
Okay. And we do want to hear your answer, Mr. Lee, so if you receive other questions. The chair will now recognize Representative Westerman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Chairman Baker, I think you've got a remarkable story, a story of American innovation, and as someone who's leading in technology, and it appears that your tribe was seeking ways, way ahead of everybody else to capture methane emissions and to reduce those emissions. And if I know that's good in itself, but were you able to commercialize this technology and bring even more business to the tribe? Chairman Baker still on?
I'm sorry, I was on mute. I believe our economic success with our business certainly enhances our ability to pursue ideas that promote our environmental stewardship, preventing those projects from competing with the other governmental services. Over the past decades of energy development by our tribe, we have gained a tremendous amount of expertise and implementation in both energy and non-energy related projects and developments. Methane capture and the Coyote Clean Power projects complement our oil and gas and infrastructure expertise as well. Plus, the strong financial standing of our businesses enables us to have the resources to find and develop projects such as these.
Yeah, and it's amazing technology that you all are developing there. And you also mentioned the Coyote project, which will generate, I believe, over 280 megawatts of electricity from natural gas while storing and capturing the CO2 emissions. Would this revolutionary process capture all the CO2 emissions generated from the facility?
Yes. Let me get my notes here. With the exception of minimal leakage through various components, yes, the Allen vent cycle is designed to inherently capture the CO2 emissions generated through the process. Large-scale infrastructure projects such as these require substantial capital funding for the development phases as well as the construction phase. Since the Coyote Clean Power project will utilize new innovative technology that creates its own unique risks, we are evaluating options to accomplish capital through the DOE's various loan guarantee programs. Additionally, federal grants to assist in federal funding in initial development, planning, and engineering provide a tremendous benefit to the tribes wishing to deploy large-scale infrastructure projects like the Coyote Clean Power.
And Chairman Baker, it sounds like this committee in Congress could learn a lot from what your tribe is doing. Do you have any final thoughts on just, maybe how much this energy development on the tribe property means? What kind of impact does that have?
Sorry, I appreciate the sentiment about how our tribe is embracing self-determination and managing our natural resources. Thankfully, due to the visionary leadership of prior tribal leaders and tribal councils, the Southern Indian Tribe was able to leverage responsible resource development on the reservation. Additionally, we have been able to leverage certain resources and expertise available from the federal government to the tribes to support business ventures. However, some of these programs are not on equal footing with other non-Indian programs. One example of the Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program through the DOE is in many ways it is disadvantageous to other loan guarantee programs such as the Innovate Energy Loan Guarantee Program that offers 100% loan guarantees to the federal bank versus only a 90% loan guarantee through a commercial bank for the tribal program. Showing up some of these inconsistencies will go a long way in creating equality in Indian country. And again, I do want to say that it is from our past leaders, going back to past councils that have got us to here, and we're always trying to do the right thing, but protect our earth.
Well, I appreciate that. I think we could all learn from that. Just real quickly here, Mr. Lee, you talked about restoring ponds, and you had some great information there about how you can use that as an educational tool for students and teachers, how you've been able to combine traditional science and wisdom, and you believe this project will actually help Hawaii to be more self-sufficient and sustainable. And I noticed from your written testimony that only 15% of these ancient ponds remain. I'm not sure what actually happened to them, but I'm so glad to see that you all are doing active management, active restoration, and that you realize the economic and cultural benefits from doing that. And I think that's a lesson we could all learn going forward when we look at federal lands on how if we manage them and take care of them, it can be beneficial to all. I'm out of time and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Westerman. The chair would now recognize Representative Geiger for 5 minutes. You're on mute.
Again. There we go. Thought I did it right the first time. All right. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses is what I was trying to say. I'd like to ask a question to Vice Chairman Taken Alive. Can you expand on why the government's responsibility to tribes as sovereign nations is different than other environmental justice communities? And what role do you believe treaties and the trust responsibility play in terms of environmental justice?
Thank you for your question, Congressman Gallegos. I appreciate that question because even amongst tribes across the country, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe has treaties and some don't. Of course, we're all federally recognized tribes, but that doesn't mean that the cookie cutter approach works for all of us. Our neighbor to the north, the three affiliated tribes of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, as well as our neighbors to the west, the Crow tribe of Montana, have exorbitant energy resources and thus require a consultation process to work for them as well. But their interests, their history, their culture is different from those of us here at Standing Rock. And it's important to honor the treaty aspect that makes us different from other communities. But looking at history, that should be an additional requirement that there has been not justice, but injustice. We've always had to sacrifice, whether it's our land, our water, our language, our religion, our way of life, essentially, so that others can prosper and gain. So viewed in that light, that would be a sense of justice to all, to us at Standing Rock.
And also, can you expand on the importance of water, especially the Missouri River, to your tribe, not just as a physical necessity, but also as a cultural resource or cultural landmark?
Oh, most certainly. We call the Missouri River Mini Sose, and it's a definite landmark. It has an important spiritual and cultural presence in our history and in our society. Most certainly at Standing Rock, we use the river for our main source of drinking water, but as well, we do have inherent treaty rights to hunting and fishing. And the lands that are along the river provide some of the best hunting, and certainly the cold waters, the deeper waters of the Missouri provide some of the best fishing. So the river is definitely important to us as a river tribe, and we do our darndest to protect it.
And Vice Chairman, last question. In your testimony, you discussed Executive Order 12898 on environmental justice that has not been well implemented. As we know, there's also an executive order requiring government-to-government tribal consultation on policies impacting tribes that is similarly inconsistently followed. Do you think committing to robust tribal consultation federal policy is a key part of addressing environmental justice?
Oh, most certainly. Of course, we have a long-standing relationship with the U.S. government that is required by treaties, but to have a requirement for meaningful and robust consultation certainly allows for more dialogue. It allows for us to present our history, our unique story, and certainly our perspective, our expertise on any matters related to projects, policy, or laws. So we appreciate the latest executive order requiring consultation.
Thank you, Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Thank you so very much. The chair would now recognize Ranking Member Obernolte for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for a really interesting hearing. I had a question for Chairman Baker. I found your testimony particularly interesting because it's a great example of a tribe that is attempting to exercise tribal sovereignty, but is being hindered in that effort by the federal government. So you testified that the tribe has successfully gained treatment as a state delegation for the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, but that the federal government has not honored the tribe's request for delegation of the federal minor source program. So I'm wondering if you believe that the tribe is better equipped than the EPA to issue clean air operating permits on tribal lands. Do you believe that, and why?
I believe that, I think we are. I think getting to this first step and this first level says a lot. If we didn't have our ducks in a row per se, then we wouldn't get to this next level. But I thought or will not monitor air and water resources as frequently as we need. The tribe should be authorized to do this and to do it according to our values and environmental standards, which are higher than the federal standards. So, we're always, like I said, we're always pushing to do one step better, and hopefully others can learn from us. Because again, a lot of these, as we move forward, are trial and error. We don't know, but you still keep moving forward each and every day, each and every year, based off of your leadership and your team within your own organization, tribal organization.
Sure, and you've already demonstrated leadership in doing that through your state delegation. Can you talk a little bit about your experience as a state delegation and how you've used that to improve the environment on your reservation?
Sorry, I think it's, really just been trial and error. If one door closes, we continue to move. We continue to keep trying. We never stop, and again, hoping that, we can get a lot of the things we want to do moving for a better tomorrow, a better environment, all those things that we don't stop, continuously moving. And if one, like I said, if one door closes, we have to keep looking and keep looking. And I think that's what we pride ourselves on, because we don't give up, we just keep going. The EPA found the tribe technically capable of taking the program, which is the main criteria for delegation. So again, they found that we were, we have other, like our water program that surpasses EPA standards. We have our own water to make potable water. We have our own facility that it pretty much surpasses EPA standards. And this has been there for over probably 15 years that we've been working on it. But as time changes, we have to keep the upgrades and keep things going. And, we've been told by, a lot of people that we have a top of the line, and it was built over 20 some years ago, but they indicated to us, who the partners we worked with, they knew what they were doing, because now that that we don't need a whole lot of changes in our facility, because, the foresight was there. Again, we just inspect more frequently, on our own reservation. We have to, because we are the caretakers of our reservation.
Right. Well, it's an inspiring story, and hope you keep up the good work. Let us know how we can help.
Thank you. Yeah, and if you're ever in the area, please come down and visit. If you're in the area, we invite you to come and see what we have, and we're willing to share that with others as well. We're just trying to do our part. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The chair would now recognize Representative Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, when you look at some of the staff analysis, that tribal lands occupy over 55 million acres of land, 57 million acres of subsurface mineral estates. The lands contain 30% of U.S. coal reserves west of the Mississippi, and 50% of potential uranium reserves, and up to 20% of known natural gas and oil reserves. You get the better sense that our Native American tribes are a big part of both domestic energy and the climate change response. But we also know the history. From 1944 to 1986, the Navajo Nation, private mining companies, extracted nearly 30 million tons of uranium ore from Navajo lands to provide the federal government with Cold War atomic weapons. Many tribal members worked in these mines, often living and raising families near the mine and mill sites. These were left abandoned, over 500 of them, and cancer rates doubled among tribal members from the 1970s to the 1990s. In Florida, we saw a degradation of the environment with regard to the Everglades. For over a century, the Seminole and Miccosukee Nation have resided in the Everglades. The region serves as a refuge for the tribes, which were forcibly displaced there by white settlements. And in that area where they grew up, we see now huge impacts on fishing and drinking water in the Everglades because of pollution from suburban sprawl, drainage, pollution, urban sprawl, and the introduction of invasive plant and species have been an ongoing issue. So we see this continuing to be an issue. And this committee is all about righting the injustices of the past and looking forward. To the Honorable Ira Taken Alive, Vice Chairman of Standing Rock Sioux Tribe, another theme we're focusing on today is the connection between Indigenous traditional knowledge and environmental preservation. If you're able to share, in what ways has the Standing Rock Sioux community utilized traditional teachings to care for and sustain the local environment And what can the federal government do to help Standing Rock Sioux Tribe continue these practices?
Thank you for your question, Congressman Soto. The Standing Rock Sioux Tribe has always relied on our cultural teachings as well as our spiritual beliefs to guide our policy. In fact, there's a provision in our tribal constitution that speaks to our unwritten laws and customs as it pertains to our beliefs and our values related to the environment, to our natural resources, including our kinship system. So we certainly depend on our culture to guide us, even in our policies and our laws, our tribal laws now. And we certainly use our cultural knowledge and our cultural expertise to hopefully help shape and influence federal policy. And certainly we opposed the Dakota Access Pipeline on those grounds. We also opposed the Dakota Access Pipeline based on our treaty rights. And so the federal courts, as part of our litigation, recognized that. And through the course of the litigation, we saw a remand and, of course, an invalidation of the easement permits for the Dakota Access Pipeline to cross the Missouri River. So to get back to your question, we certainly do rely heavily on our cultural practices, our cultural beliefs, and everything that we do.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. And Mr. Herb Lee Jr. Of the Pacific American Foundation, your testimony mentions that over 450 fish ponds were built across the Hawaiian Islands, with some dating back to over 800 years ago. Can you speak further on the history of these fish ponds, as well as their significance, and how the Waikalua fish pond fit in this history?
Yeah, these ponds were spread out over all of the islands. Some of them range in size from, mine is considered a small pond, about 12 acres. Some of them range in size to 500 to 900 acres in size. And they were very important in terms of providing protein, for the people of old. Over the course of time, when we went from the chiefs owning all of the land to private land ownership in 1848, we call it the Great Mahelia, the Great Divide. That's when the chiefs could no longer be able to, amass the labor to take care of these ponds. And so the degradation of these ponds took place after that. And of course, urbanization of Hawaii basically destroyed a lot of the ponds until we get to today, in the 21st century. There's only about 15% of them left, spread across 6 major islands. But I believe that, in working at these ponds, that they hold the key to unlocking, both the indigenous wisdom to restock the nearshore fisheries, which have basically been fished out. And with the threat now of global climate change, sea level rise that we experience now every year, invasive species, things like that, and as a result, the decimation of a lot of our native species, it's been a big challenge. And I feel that Waikalua Local, our fish pond, kind of holds the key to helping restore some of that knowledge so that we can use that knowledge to be able to propagate and restore some of these fisheries again.
Thanks. My time is
Thank you very much. The chair would now recognize Representative Rosendale for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the panel members today for coming in and providing us with all this perspective. The hearing the majority has convened today is just to discuss environmental justice in indigenous communities. But one thing that I think is lost on many of my colleagues across the aisle is the economic injustice their war on traditional energy will have on tribal communities. In Montana, traditional energy, especially coal, is critically important to tribal communities, especially the Crow Nation. My good friend, AJ Not Afraid, the past chairman of the Crow tribe, likes to say a war on coal is a war on the Crow Nation. Located near Hardin, Montana, and the Crow Reservation, the Absaloka Mine is a 10,427-acre permitted single-pit surface coal mine complex. The coal reserves are leased by the Crow tribe through a partnership with Westmoreland Mining providing critical resources for the tribal community. The coal leased by the Crow tribe is part of a 46-year relationship with over 200 million tons of coal sold. Since 2000, over $325 million in taxes and royalties have been paid to the Crow tribe for their coal mineral leases. These collections were paid to tribal members as per capita payments to help the Crow tribal government. This benefits nearly 11,000 members of the Crow tribe and nearly 8,000 members living on the reservation. For much of the mine's life, the mine has provided over 70% of the tribe's non-federal revenues for the Crow tribal government, and currently 59% of the mine's employment are Crow tribal members. But over the past month, Democrats on this committee have made it clear that their priorities are to increase the cost of doing business for oil, natural gas, and coal companies in order to put them out of business. They will stop at nothing to pursue their radical environmental agenda, even if it means putting Crow tribal members out of a job and tribal government in dire budgetary straits. The coal in the Absaloka mine is mined with some of the most stringent environmental standards in the world. And the coal industry is very conscious of their impact on the environment and is pursuing every possibility, like carbon capture, to limit their emissions. We need to be fostering this green innovation to ensure that coal communities like the Crow tribe are able to continue to thrive. This is economic justice. I hope that we're able to work together in a bipartisan way to be good stewards of our environment while also ensuring the economic sustainability of our rural communities who depend on traditional energy production. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Representative McCullum for 5 minutes. Representative.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing today. It's vitally important that the experiences and the priorities of tribal nations are fully incorporated into our efforts to address environmental justice. Our government-to-government relationships, the trust and treaty responsibilities we have to Native Americans require nothing less. As the witnesses today made very clear, our federal agencies have often failed to understand and respect environmental justice and what that means for Indigenous populations. And that includes the failure to protect tribal homelands, the guaranteed treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather traditional and subsistence foods. I am hopeful that the Biden administration and this Congress can begin to address these historic and ongoing injustices. As Vice Chair of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee, I was excited to see the President's proposal for $936 million to accelerate environmental economic justice initiatives. The Indigenous communities have often bore the burden of pollution, climate change, and this new funding is critically important. We've also heard testimony from tribal leaders on the need for greater investments to clean up abandoned mines and wells and leaky underground storage tanks in the past. But we need to be committed not just to cleaning up legacy pollution, but also supporting tribal nations in defending their treaty protected resources today. I saw the Biden administration's commitment to that last month when EPA Region 5 stepped up to require wild rice waters contaminated with sulfite from industrial pollution be listed on the state of Minnesota's Clean Water Act impaired waters list. It's been a priority for tribal nations in our state as sulfite pollution has impacted this traditional and vital food source, also a source of economic income for many tribes. Understanding reserve treaty rights and protecting first foods is fundamental to understanding what environmental justice means to Native American tribes. I thank EPA Administrator Reagan for when he appeared in front of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee for consulting with tribes on their water quality concerns and acting to identify these waters. I'd like to hear from you, Chairman Taken Alive. As you know, I have the honor of representing Sioux and Anishinaabe nations in Minnesota. What it would look like if the federal government truly lived up to its responsibility to tribal nations to protect your water, to protect your land and the health of your people. You've spoken clearly about what it looks like when the federal government has failed to do tribal consultation, failed to protect your access to clean air, clean water, and first foods. So what would true accountability and restoration look like to those Sioux Nation members in Standing Rock?
Thank you for your question, Congresswoman McCollum, and it's certainly great to see you again. I know one of the last times we had encountered each other was here at Standing Rock, as well as Chairwoman Fernandez, so you're most certainly welcome back again. But to get to your question, certainly it's been talked about in my comments and other comments from not just the members, but also the witnesses, to have meaningful consultation. And as I had stated before in one of my previous responses, making a phone call and leaving a voicemail message for the record is not meaningful consultation. What that means to us, meaningful consultation is an opportunity to present our interests and our concerns on any prospective or proposed law, project, or undertaking that requires a federal government approval, and most certainly to present our perspective, our expertise, and certainly our knowledge on how such a project or law would affect us directly, not just for us today, but for future generations of Standing Rock Sioux tribe members. So meaningful consultation would certainly be an important component of making right the injustices of the past, because certainly we owe it to our future generations.
Thank you. And thank you for the work that you do along the Missouri River. And Madam Chair, for those who don't know a lot about what happened with the pipeline issue, there was a taking of the land early on when electrification was put through on tribal lands in Standing Rock. So this was the second assault on the tribal boundaries. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative. The chair will now recognize Representative Chuy Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, and of course, all of our fantastic witnesses for joining us today. Too often, Indigenous voices are silenced or left out of key policy decisions, and this is especially true in the environmental justice movement. I don't need to remind everyone here that the exploitation of Indigenous communities is directly tied to exploitation of our natural resources, or that the economic interests are always prioritized over the rights of tribal communities or of our country's history of broken treaties. You heard it just 2 weeks ago when Republicans in this committee continue to defend giving away sacred lands known as Oak Flats to foreign mining companies. What I'm here to remind us is that unfortunately, even with the environmental justice system, Indigenous voices are not always heard. I want to address my question to Vice Chair Ira Taken Alive. In your testimony, you described that the Dakota Access Pipeline as a tragic example of the federal agencies failing to properly implement environmental justice doctrine in its decision-making. And of course, Chairman Grijalva already raised this concern about whether tribal Indigenous communities were consulted or not in that. Again, can you underscore why it's important that a process and the community be meaningfully involved?
Thank you for your question, Congressman Garcia. Most certainly, when it comes to environmental justice, our opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline didn't rest on any opposition to energy development, whether it be oil or coal or even green energy development. Our opposition rested on environmental justice issues of having the decency of an emergency response plan that was congruent with our land, congruent with our water, and congruent with the needs of our people. As well, it rested on the protection of our ancient rights and practices of hunting and fishing along the Missouri River. And of course, those are protected by treaty. As well, there was environmental justice issues related to the protection of our water. The Missouri River is the sole source of our potable drinking water, and it serves our entire 2.3 million acre reservation. And it benefits tribal members and non-tribal members alike. So when you talk about environmental justice, we can certainly point to certain cases across the country, Flint, Michigan being one, but at Standing Rock, there is an injustice and the potential catastrophe that an oil spill, an oil leak in the pipeline crossing of the Missouri River would have a devastating impact, not just on our drinking water source, but also the source of water for our agriculture and our economy.
Thank you. In your testimony, you also described that for Standing Rock, this failure resulted in a world movement calling for the federal government to do better. In your view, were Indigenous communities leading and central in this world movement?
Oh, most definitely, Congressman Garcia. Certainly, we had envisioned a protest, a peaceful protest, a gathering of prayer to be mainly several people, but it turned into one of the largest cities in North Dakota at the time. There were upwards of 17,000 people gathered in protest, gathered in prayer. And most certainly, the voices of the youth raised the profile of the issue. The youth of the Standing Rock, the future of Standing Rock had raised that issue. And certainly, we welcomed the peaceful actions of the protest, the prayers of the protest, and it brought worldwide attention to the issue of environmental justice, or in our case, injustice. But it also raised the profile of other American Indian issues as well. During the time of the protest, the Indian Health Services, which is of course a federal agency, as we all know, reported 0 suicide attempts and 0 suicide completions at the time amongst American Indian populations. So it certainly served the purpose to raise the profile of environmental injustice and environmental justice, but also raise the profile of American Indians overall, not just in this country, but around the world.
And maybe this will be an inspiration for the larger environmental justice movement. Environmental movements have not always been an ally to Indigenous peoples and communities. In fact, the early conservation movement in the U.S. lobbied to create the national park system that displaced and expelled Native peoples from their homelands and hunting grounds. We must ensure that Indigenous communities are not only part of the decision-making process, but leading these conversations. Anything less will simply perpetuate environmental injustice. This is much more than a legal issue or even an economic one. Land plays an integral role in cultural, spiritual, and religious lives of Indigenous peoples.
Thank you.
I'm sure I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Garcia. The chair now recognizes Representative Case for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and Mr. Lee. Aloha kakahiaka, very early in Hawaii. It's good to see you, and I apologize to you for not being on this hearing earlier on this subcommittee, which I proudly serve on. I was on another subcommittee hearing in my Appropriations Committee on military construction, needed to ask some questions over on that side. So I'm playing a little bit of catch up here. So apologies for that. And by the way, I'm also a resident of Haliko Waikalua Homestead, Kaneohe, so I'm close to home with you. I am going to kind of give you open season with my time because I'm otherwise going to ask questions out of context and ask you whether you have any comments that you want to make for the record or expansion of your testimony. based on what you've heard from other my colleagues on the subcommittee and or the other witnesses? Is there any place that you're sitting there saying, I really would like to chime in on that?
Thank you very much, and aloha kakayaka to you as well. Yeah, over the last 25, 26 years that we've been restoring, we've learned a lot. Obviously, climate change is beginning to have increasing impact on the islands, and especially, our fish pond. We started to encounter, sea level rise conditions from 2016, and it basically, devastated, our wall. And we've been on a mission to restore and actually increase, the size of the wall. But more importantly than that, I think, it's an opportunity in the next 25 years that we've set for the restoration of the pond is to really now begin to propagate, and look at trying to be more food sustainable for our island community, because basically our nearshore fisheries are pretty much fished out. And with whatever remaining fish ponds that we have across the islands, I really believe that we hold the key to be able to helping to restock the nearshore fisheries of all of the Hawaiian Islands and get us to be less dependent on foreign sources of food coming into the islands, and try to begin to flip that switch over the next 25 years so that we can be a little bit more self-sustainable. And I think in the context of the Hawaiian fish ponds, there's aquaculture and the economy that's based on aquaculture is a proven type of resource for our people in Hawaii. And I'm hoping that, there can be more initiatives going forward, more opportunities for us to expand aquaculture industry in the islands so that we can get back to more of a food sustainable economy.
Thank you, Mr. Lee. Let me ask you a question that kind of occurred to me as you were talking. Of course, the subject of this hearing is environmental justice for Indigenous communities. Do you feel that there's particular areas where Native Hawaiians are affected differently from an environmental justice perspective than, for example, my colleague, Mr. Garcia, was speaking passionately to on the continent? Are there distinguishing areas for the indigenous peoples of Hawaii versus American Indians and Alaska Natives?
Well, again, I think, a lot of our native species, our culture, is based on the protection of a lot of and trying to bring back some of the native species, our foods and things like that, from both the land as well as the sea. And a lot of these, those kinds of food opportunities and the environments upon which we have to try to grow them, I think have been subjected to a lot of impacts, in environmental degradation, urbanization, water resources that are polluted from non-point source pollution to, putting facilities that could impact, nearshore fisheries and create opportunities or situations where we cannot practice, and help restore some of the native species and varieties that are really important to our diet and to our culture, and more importantly, to the health, of our people. So I think that goes hand in hand. And so I think part of my journey has been to try to educate not just Native Hawaiians, but everybody in terms of the indigenous wisdom and get back to that so that we can restore our environment to be a healthy and productive one.
Okay, thank you so much for being here and joining us. I appreciate it. Mahalo. I yield back.
Thank you so very much. I now recognize myself for a series of questions. I want to begin by quickly clarifying a comment I've heard from a colleague today about what does sovereignty look like. I think when a tribal government wants a natural resource economy, whether it be oil and gas or coal, that is their right as a sovereign government entity. It becomes a federal trust responsibility and an environmental justice problem when a tribal community does not want those projects. Or as Vice Chairman Ira Taken Alive said earlier, and I think I'm going to quote this, they are forced to sacrifice so others can gain. And we have seen that played out over and over. In New Mexico, there are countless examples of this. The Navajo Nation, Pueblo of Laguna, for example, are still dealing with abandoned uranium mines. And San Juan County, which includes many areas of the Navajo Nation, and there's been fossil fuel development, coal, oil and gas, burning is common. And they received an F in the American Lung Association's 2021 State of the Air report, and respiratory infections are the #1 acute and chronic health risk for New Mexican Medicaid patients. So I think it is time that we take meaningful action to rectify these wrongs, like the Orphan Rock Cleanup and Jobs Act, and by reauthorizing RECA. And in the process, elevating tribal voices early on in the decision-making process. I also appreciate the witnesses' responses today in favor of codifying the government-to-government consultation process so it doesn't disappear when an administration, like we recently saw, doesn't care about tribal sovereignty. Vice Chairman Ira Taken Alive. In Chairman Baker's testimony, we heard him so eloquently describe how the Southern Ute tribe has its own Department of Energy and has robust environmental monitoring and pollution controls like capturing methane, which are actually stronger than EPA regulations. He also noted that Southern Ute standards are higher, as I noted. But many other tribes, as you know, don't have the financial and technical resources to conduct this kind of high-level monitoring or pollution control themselves. So do you think that Congress should provide more resources, whether to EPA or to the tribes themselves, so that they too can monitor and reduce pollution on their lands?
Thank you for your question, Chairwoman Ledger Fernandez. Most certainly, and whether it's through the EPA or directly, certainly we stand ready for any types of investments that the federal government would like to make in tribes like Standing Rock that do not have the natural resources like oil and gas. Certainly, during your visit to Standing Rock, you probably noticed we have a lot of wind, and whether it's cold wind in the winter or hot winds in the summer, and most certainly we have a lot of sunshine. So we stand to benefit from any potential federal investment in renewable or green energies that would probably put us in a good economic position, like our friends, or like our neighbors to the north, the 3 affiliate tribes, and our neighbors to the west, the Crow tribe. And certainly, as Congressman Rosendale had mentioned, the quest for economic justice, as well as a quest for environmental justice, doesn't necessarily have to be in conflict. So a codification of the meaningful consultation process would be beneficial, as well as the federal government elevates the voices of each tribe in a non-cookie cutter individual approach.
Thank you. I want to follow up on that a bit in terms of some of the conversations we've had around what happened at Standing Rock with the Dakota pipeline. And I served on as vice chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and we actually issued a letter to the Army Corps saying you had not done adequate consultation. So I'm wondering if rather what we really also need to do is look at that act, Section 103, and whether we should require that the consultation become earlier in the planning process, be required to become earlier in the planning process so that the tribes are aware of alternatives instead of being forced to consider a single option. What do you think of that?
I think that's a very important step to include the consultation process at the outset, because a lot of projects, as we've seen, and it was no different for the Dakota Access Pipeline, the permits necessary to conduct or install, construct the pipeline started at the state level as well. So when a project begins at the state level, it seems as though it's an automatic green light for continued construction. So a consultation process, meaningful consultation process at the outset of any project would definitely be welcomed.
Well, thank you very much. And I have run out of time. I had wanted to ask Mr. Lee about the role that the fish ponds would also play with regards to improving diet and health outcomes for your people. I loved hearing about that. With regards to, we have Mr. Chairman Baker, thank you for returning. And I'm sorry, but we have run out of questions for you. But you have served us so well, each of you, in describing to this committee today the issues from three unique perspectives. One is from the role that the Southern Ute plays. And as you know, I have been to Southern Ute in the past. I provided some legal advice to Southern Ute, and I have taken tribes to Southern Ute because of your ground path making way of addressing how you treat your natural resources and develop them in a sound environmental and economic way. I am very grateful to the testimony about how we bring in this indigenous wisdom that is described in Hawaii, and I hope to go visit some of your fish ponds in the near future. I think many of us would like to go make a visit to Standing Rock to visit the fish ponds and to see the amazing work of Southern Ute in the near future. I thank the witnesses and my colleagues for their excellent questions. As I stated before, the members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit written questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. I made a closing statement, so I'm going to give you, Ranking Member, if you would like to say anything in closing as well.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to join you in thanking our witnesses. This has been a fascinating hearing on an incredibly important topic, that of environmental justice for our Indigenous peoples. And again, I think we always need to be mindful when we talk about impacts on the environment that anything that we do seems to fall disproportionately on the backs of our Indigenous communities. So I think it's very important that we be mindful of that fact and that we engage our communities in those discussions. So thank you very much for convening the hearing. It's been an honor to be part of it.
Thank you, Ranking Member. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned. Goodbye, everybody.